Alright then, mates. Here we go with Mr. Haney versus Mr. Diaz Jr. This is going to be a brief tactical breakdown as to the reason and or reasons I think Mr. Haney was victorious and Mr. Diaz Jr. was not. You can normally pick up on things that they've been working on in preparation for this fight during the warm-up process in the dressing room. I notice here Mr. Diaz Jr. appeared to be focused on staying on the outside of the right-handed Mr. Haney's jab. I could be wrong, but it looked that way to me just from the quick mitt work they're doing to warm up. Alright, let's get into this. Right from the very start, I can see Mr. Haney using that jab as a feeler. Within this diagram in front of you was Mr. Haney's keys to victory. I like his plan. I'm not saying this was their actually plan they created, but based on my analysis and interpretation and my opinion, this was a very good plan by Mr. Haney. And what was that plan? Let's break it down. That feeler jab I discussed earlier, here we can see it's literally not a jab. What Mr. Haney's doing here is collecting data. He's touching Mr. Diaz's gloves to calculate range, distance, proximity, and many other things. Let's go below the location B, the midsection of Mr. Diaz. This location plays a vital role in this whole plan, but I'll be getting back to that in a second. Focusing on location C down below, the red divisional line separating the two fighters. It would be to Mr. Haney's best interest to keep Mr. Diaz on the outside of that line. For tactical benefits, Diaz, being the shorter fighter, needs to close the range a bit more, and Haney, having the slight height and reach advantage, needs space and room to punch. So besides the jab being used as a tool to maintain space, location B down below provides another route to take. But unlike the jab, location B offers two things. It offers the space Mr. Haney needs, and it also causes Mr. Diaz to have to step backwards a step or two. For Mr. Diaz, dealing with that line will not be as pleasurable as it is for Mr. Haney. But in order for Mr. Diaz to be effective, he has to cross that line and able to gain access to Mr. Haney. Alright, and here's the proof. As you can see, Mr. Haney targeting the midsection of Mr. Diaz and driving him back. Also pay attention to Mr. Haney's rear knee, indicated with the white arrow. This is not a wide stance. His legs aren't straight, his knees aren't locked. This is what you call good low penetration. And here we see it from a different angle. Low penetration. Good impact to the midsection of Mr. Diaz, which will cause him to step back a step or two, giving Haney time to recover and prepare himself as Mr. Diaz approaches again. Anyway, you get the idea. Those straight rights to the body push Mr. Diaz back, greatly offsetting him, allowing Haney to maintain his space and or gain his space. As I said earlier, Mr. Diaz and his dealings with that line will not be as pleasurable as it is for Mr. Haney. And here's one example of that right here. Mr. Diaz can't get across that line to access Mr. Haney, so he's going to attempt to gain access from the line. And here we see it again. Mr. Diaz Jr., forced to stay outside, attempts to connect from a great distance and misses greatly. On the downside, misses such as this, with the extreme falling in overextension, can be countered easily. Okay, I'd like to close on this note here. I wasn't anti Mr. Diaz Jr. before the fight, and I was not pro Mr. Haney before the fight. I hope the best man would win, and it appears the best man has won. My analysis might seem a bit one-sided, which would be true, but there's a specific reason. Simply, Mr. Diaz Jr. did not give me much to analyze. Don't get me wrong, he had his moments, but there were moments. While on the other hand, Mr. Haney was more consistent in what he was doing and stayed more busy and active, and it appeared he had a plan or some structure. Maybe it was premeditated, or maybe it just flowed naturally. Any which way it goes, it was a very good fight. Mr. Diaz Jr. did very well for himself, and quite obviously Mr. Devin Haney did extremely well for himself.